Surin hadn't expected to spend her first morning in Dreadhollow on her hands and knees scrubbing blood off a stone floor, but here she was, knees aching against ancient flagstone, a rough, bristled brush in her hand, and the metallic tang of old blood filling her nostrils with every stroke. The great hall of Dreadhollow Keep stretched around her like the ribcage of something enormous and long dead. Massive iron chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings so high the candlelight barely reached them. Banners lined the walls, black and silver, each one bearing the snarling wolf crest of the Voss bloodline. The stone beneath her was cold enough to numb her kneecaps through the thin fabric of her skirt, and the silence of the empty hall pressed against her ears like water. She scrubbed harder. The stain wouldn't lift. Someone's blood, old and stubborn, had soaked into the grain of the stone and decided to stay forever. She understood the impulse. Once something stained you deep enough, no amount of scrubbing could undo it. It had been less than 12 hours since she'd arrived. Less than 12 hours since Theron Ashgrove, alpha of the Ashgrove Pack, the man who had stood before their entire territory 3 years ago and called her his destined Luna, his heart, his forever, had handed her over to his rival like a sack of grain offered in trade. She could still hear his voice, steady and indifferent, as he'd addressed the assembly. As a gesture of good faith and lasting peace between our territories, I offer my Luna to the Dreadhollow Pack. No hesitation, no crack in his composure. He hadn't even looked at her, not once. She'd searched his face for something. Anything. A flinch. A shadow of guilt. The smallest flicker that might suggest this was difficult for him. There was nothing. She might as well have been a chair he was donating. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of standing beside him at every ceremony and banquet and alliance dinner, smiling until her face ached, supporting his decisions even when they cut against her instincts, managing his household with a precision he never once acknowledged, enduring his coldness when the doors were closed and the public performance was over. And in the end, she was worth less to him than a ceasefire. The brush slipped. Serene's knuckles cracked against the stone, and she hissed through her teeth. "Careful." A voice from behind her, low and dry. "That floor has survived 4 centuries. You won't." Serene looked up. A woman stood in the doorway, old enough that her hair had gone entirely white, but with eyes so sharp they could have cut glass. She wore a healer's apron stained with something green and pungent. "I'm fine," Serene said quickly, tucking her bleeding knuckles against her thigh. The woman's gaze dropped to the hidden hand. Clearly. Before Serene could respond, a sound rolled through the hall. Not a sound exactly, more of a vibration, deep and resonant, rising through the floor and into her bones. The flagstone beneath her right knee grew warm, then hot. Serene scrambled backward. The stone she'd been scrubbing, a massive slab darker than the rest, older, carved with symbols so worn they were barely visible, was glowing. Faint at first, a pale gold light bleeding through the cracks and grooves of the ancient carvings, then brighter, pulsing, alive. The warmth spread up through her palms where they'd pressed flat against the floor. It didn't burn. It felt like sunlight after a long winter, like the first breath after being underwater too long. The white-haired woman dropped the bundle she'd been carrying. "That's not possible," she whispered. The glow intensified. The carved symbols, unreadable moments ago, sharpened into focus as light filled their channels like molten gold pouring through riverbeds. The vibration deepened, and Serene felt it in her chest, in the hollow behind her ribs, in a place she didn't have a name for. Footsteps. Fast and heavy. The great hall doors crashed open. He entered like a storm front. Calum Voss, alpha of Dreadhollow, was the kind of man whose presence rearranged a room simply by occupying it. Tall enough that the doorframe seemed built for lesser men. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw cut from something harder than bone. The scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth only made him look more dangerous, like a warning carved into skin. He stopped 3 strides into the hall. His gaze found the glowing stone. Then it found her. Seren was still on the floor, soap sutted to the elbows, hair falling out of its knot, bleeding knuckles, and kneeling directly on top of the one artifact his territory had been trying to wake for 200 years. The silence was absolute. Behind him, 2 men and a woman had followed him in, and all 3 stood frozen. One of them, a tall man with copper-red hair and the bearing of a second-in-command, looked at Seren, looked at the stone, and then looked at his alpha with an expression that suggested the world had just tilted sideways. "Who is this?" Calum asked. His voice was quiet, controlled, and somehow that was worse than shouting. The white-haired woman stepped forward. "The girl from Ashgrove. She arrived last night. I found her here scrubbing the floor when the hearthstone activated." Calum's dark eyes hadn't left Seren's face. She couldn't read his expression. It wasn't anger exactly, but it wasn't wonder either. It was something colder, something calculating, and it made her want to disappear into the stone beneath her. "The hearthstone," the copper-haired man said slowly, "hasn't responded to anyone in 2 centuries." "I know what the hearthstone does, Orin," Calum said, still looking at her. Seren's mouth opened. No sound came out. She tried again. "I was just scrubbing," she managed, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "I didn't do anything." But the stone was still glowing beneath her, warm and golden and pulsing in rhythm with something she could feel, but not name. And every person in the room was staring at her like she had just set fire to the world. That was 3 weeks ago, and to understand how a discarded Luna ended up kneeling on an ancient artifact in the great hall of her enemy's keep, you need to go back to the beginning. The day Theron gave her away started like any other. Seren woke alone, which was normal. Theron hadn't shared her bed in over a year. She dressed, braided her hair, and walked the long corridor to the breakfast hall, where she sat at the head table beside an empty chair and ate in silence, while the household staff moved around her like water around a stone. Being Luna of Ashgrove was, in theory, a position of immense privilege. In practice, it meant Seren organized menus, approved supply orders, settled domestic disputes between staff, and smiled. She smiled at dinners. She smiled at ceremonies. She smiled when Theron introduced her to visiting alphas as though she were a painting he'd hung on the wall, something pleasant to look at but not particularly important. She had learned to make herself useful because useful people were harder to discard. Or so she had believed. The summons came at midday. A formal assembly, all ranked members required to attend. Seren assumed it was another trade negotiation. Theron had been in talks with the Dread Hollow Pack for months, trying to secure passage through their northern corridor, a critical route that Ashgrove needed for winter supply lines. She dressed carefully in the deep green that Theron preferred and took her place beside him on the raised platform. He didn't acknowledge her arrival. He rarely did anymore. The hall was full. Pack elders, warriors, advisors, merchants, all seated in careful hierarchy. At the far end, flanked by 4 of his own men, stood a figure Seren had never seen in person. Calum Voss. Even from across the room, the weight of him was undeniable. He stood perfectly still while everyone around him shifted and whispered, and his stillness was the loudest thing in the hall. His dark eyes moved across the assembly with the patience of someone cataloging threats, and when his gaze passed over Seren, it lingered for half a second before moving on. That half second made her skin prickle. Theron stood. The hall went quiet. "The Ashgrove Pack and the Dread Hollow Pack have reached an accord," Theron announced, his voice carrying easily. "Dread Hollow will grant us unrestricted passage through their northern corridor for a period of 10 years. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Seren allowed herself a small breath of relief. This was good news. Trade would stabilize. The pack would be secure through winter. In exchange, Theron continued, and something in his tone shifted, flattened, emptied. I offer the Dreadhollow pack a bond of trust in the form of my Luna. The silence that followed was so complete Seren could hear the candles burning. She turned to look at him. He was already looking straight ahead. What? The word fell out of her mouth before she could stop it. Seren will reside at Dreadhollow for the duration of the Accord, Theron said, as though she hadn't spoken. She will serve as a living guarantee of Ashgrove's commitment to peace. Her legs went numb. The room swam at its edges. She gripped the arm of her chair because the floor had become uncertain, and she needed something solid beneath her hands. Theron, she whispered, reaching for him. He stepped to the side, a small movement, barely perceptible, but it put him exactly out of her reach. The transfer will take place tomorrow at dawn, he said. I trust Alpha Voss will treat her with appropriate courtesy. Across the hall, Calum Voss said nothing. His expression didn't change, but his gaze had returned to Seren, and this time it stayed. The assembly dissolved into noise, but Seren heard none of it. She sat frozen on the platform, her hands white-knuckled on the chair, and tried to make the words make sense. A living guarantee. Not a Luna. Not a wife. Not even a person. A guarantee. She found him afterward, in his study, already reviewing documents as though he hadn't just dismantled her life in front of 300 people. Why? She asked from the doorway. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Theron didn't look up. It's politics, Seren. Don't make it personal. You're giving me to another pack. How is that not personal? He sighed the way he always sighed when she asked questions he considered beneath him. Voss wanted collateral. You're the highest value asset I can offer without weakening our military position. Asset. The word landed like a slap. Not wife. Not partner. Not even a person with preferences or fears or a heartbeat that raced when she was afraid. An asset. Something to be weighed on a scale against grain routes and winter supply lines. And if I refuse? She asked. Theron finally looked at her. There was nothing in his eyes. No guilt, no conflict, no love. Certainly not love. Just the mild irritation of a man whose schedule had been interrupted. You're my Luna, he said. You go where I send you. She left his study without another word. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't pack. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed her hands flat against her stomach and tried to remember the last time he had touched her with any tenderness at all. She couldn't. And somehow, that was the thing that hurt most. Not the betrayal itself, but the realization that there was nothing left to betray. Whatever had existed between them, if anything ever had, was already gone long before he offered her up like livestock at auction. Dawn came cold and gray. A carriage waited in the courtyard, flanked by Dreadhollow riders. Seren carried one trunk, everything she owned that Theron hadn't claimed as pack property. No one came to say goodbye. Not a single member of the household she had managed for 3 years. Not one person she had helped or fed or comforted when they were sick. The courtyard was empty except for the guards and the horses and the damp morning air. She climbed into the carriage without looking back. The door closed. The wheels began to turn, and Ashgrove disappeared behind her like it had never existed at all. The journey took 2 days. The Dreadhollow territory was north and east, past the tree line, into terrain that grew wilder and rockier with every mile. The forests here were older, denser, and the air carried a strange metallic taste that Seren couldn't place. When the carriage finally stopped and she stepped out, Dreadhollow Keep loomed above her like a fist of black stone punched through the hillside. It was ancient, brutal, and completely unwelcoming. A steward met her at the gate. "You'll be housed in the East Wing," he said, not unkindly but without warmth. "Meals are at 6 and noon. You'll be assigned duties tomorrow." "Duties?" Serene blinked. I'm the Luna of Ashgrove. The steward looked at her for a long moment. Something almost like pity crossed his face. Not here, he said. That night, alone in a cold room that smelled of dust and disuse, Serene lay on a narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and felt the full weight of what had happened settle onto her chest like a stone. She was nothing here. Not a Luna, not a wife, not even a guest. She was collateral, a body offered in trade, and the man who should have protected her had been the one to give her away. Her wolf, quiet for years beneath Theron's cold indifference, stirred restlessly inside her. Something was coming. She could feel it in the strange metallic taste of the air, in the way the ground beneath Dreadhollow seemed to hum with a frequency just below hearing. Something was very, very wrong with this place. Duties, it turned out, meant whatever no one else wanted to do. Serene spent her first week at Dreadhollow scrubbing floors, hauling firewood, and sorting dried provisions in a cellar so cold her fingers went blue. The pack members treated her with a spectrum ranging from indifference to open hostility. She was the enemy's Luna, a political pawn sent to live among them, and no one trusted her. She didn't blame them. She wouldn't have trusted her either. But while the social isolation stung, it was the land itself that consumed her attention. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with Dreadhollow's territory. She noticed it first during a supply run to the eastern storehouse. The path wound through a stretch of forest that should have been thick with summer growth, but the trees were wrong. Their bark had gone ashen and brittle, leaves curled inward, brown at the edges despite the season. The undergrowth was sparse where it should have been dense, and the soil beneath her feet felt hollow, like walking on the skin of a drum. Has it always been like this? Serene asked the supply hand walking beside her, a stocky woman named Petra who had barely spoken 3 words to her all week. Petra glanced at the trees. Worse every year, she said shortly. The blight. The blight? Ground's dying. Started maybe 5-6 years ago up in the northern reaches. Creeps south a little more each season. Nothing grows right. Game moves away. Rivers taste like iron. That explained the metallic tang in the air. Does anyone know why? Serene asked. Petra gave her a look that said she'd exceeded her question allotment and walked faster. But Serene couldn't stop noticing. The wrongness of the land pulled at her attention like a thread snagging on a nail. She felt it in the mornings when she crossed the courtyard and the flagstones hummed beneath her feet. She felt it at night when she pressed her palm flat against the wall of her room and something pulsed back. Faint and rhythmic, like a heartbeat buried deep underground. She told herself she was imagining things. Grief and displacement could do strange things to a person's mind. She told herself this right up until the morning she found the dead garden. It was behind the east wing, a walled courtyard that had clearly once been beautiful. Stone planters lined the walls, empty now except for dry soil and the skeletal remains of whatever had once grown there. A fountain stood in the center, dry and cracked, its basin thick with dead leaves. Serene knelt beside one of the planters and pressed her hand into the soil. It was cold, powdery, completely lifeless, like ash. But beneath it, beneath the dead layer, she felt something. A warmth. A hum. The same pulse she'd felt through the walls, stronger here, more insistent. Without thinking, she pushed her fingers deeper into the soil. The warmth surged up through her hand and into her arm, and for one dizzying second, she saw something that wasn't there. A flash of green, impossibly vivid, living green, and the sound of running water, and light, golden light rising from below, a city, towers of pale stone, a sky that wasn't a sky but a vast underground cavern lit by something that burned like captured sunlight. Then it was gone, and she was kneeling in a dead garden with dirt under her fingernails and her heart slamming against her ribs. What was that? She whispered to no one. Interesting. Serene whipped around. The white-haired woman from the great hall, the one who'd witnessed the hearthstone, stood at the garden entrance with her arms crossed and one eyebrow raised. "You again," Seren managed, still shaking. "Nesta," the woman said, "head healer. And you're the Ashgrove girl who lit up an artifact that's been dead since before my grandmother was born." Seren opened her mouth to protest, to explain, to say she hadn't done anything. "Save it," Nesta cut in, moving closer. "I've been watching you since you arrived. You touch things, and they react. The hearthstone in the Great Hall was only the most dramatic example. I've seen the corridor sconces flicker when you pass. I've seen frost melt off the courtyard stones where you've walked." She paused, studying Seren with those glass-sharp eyes. "What did you just see when you touched the soil?" Seren hesitated. Everything inside her screamed to keep quiet, to stay invisible, to not give anyone a reason to notice her. Being noticed in Ashgrove had never led to anything good. But Nesta waited with the patience of someone who had all day and no intention of leaving without an answer. "A city," Seren said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Underground, towers of white stone, golden light. It was beautiful." Nesta's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind her eyes. Something old and heavy moved into place. "Come with me," Nesta said. She didn't wait for a response. Seren followed on unsteady legs through corridors she hadn't yet learned, down a staircase that spiraled deeper into the keep than she'd realized the building went. Nesta's workroom was carved directly into the rock, a low-ceilinged chamber lined with shelves of dried herbs, glass jars, leather-bound volumes, and instruments Seren couldn't name. Nesta closed the door and turned to face her. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room," she said. "Understood?" Seren's stomach dropped. Those words never preceded anything good. "Dreadhollow is dying," Nesta said flatly. "Not slowly, not metaphorically. The territory itself is failing. The blight you've seen in the forests is only the surface. Beneath this land lies something ancient, something sealed, and whatever is holding that seal together is cracking." She pulled a leather-bound volume from the shelf and opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. The illustration showed an underground kingdom, towers of pale stone beneath a vaulted cavern ceiling, lit by a source of light at its center. Seren's breath caught. It was exactly what she'd seen. "Lithenmere," Nesta said, "the lost kingdom. Sealed 3 centuries ago after the Fall Wars, when the ruling bloodline was scattered and the kingdom's heart was locked away to prevent it from being taken by conquerors." She tapped the illustration. The seal was never meant to hold forever. It was meant to hold until someone of the old blood returned to open it properly. But no one came. And now the seal is decaying, and everything it's holding back, the kingdom's power, its magic, its trapped dead, is leaking into the land above like poison from a cracked vessel. Seren stared at the illustration. "And you think I'm connected to this? Because of the hearthstone?" Nesta closed the book. "The hearthstone is a lock. It was placed in this hall specifically because Dreadhollow was built on top of Lithenmere's main gate. It responds to one thing and one thing only." She paused, letting the weight of what she was about to say fill the room. "Royal blood," Nesta finished. "The bloodline of Lithenmere's last queen." The floor seemed to shift beneath Seren's feet. "That's not possible. I'm no one. My family were farmers in the eastern reaches of Ashgrove. We didn't have titles. We didn't have anything." "Bloodlines don't care about titles," Nesta said. "They care about blood. And yours just woke up a stone that's been sleeping for 200 years. A knock on the door. Sharp. Deliberate. Nesta opened it to reveal Orin, the copper-haired beta, his face carefully neutral. "The Alpha requests the Ashgrove woman's presence," Orin said. "Immediately." Seren's heart plummeted through her shoes. "Does he know?" she asked Nesta in a frantic whisper. "About the hearthstone? He was there, child. About Lithenmere?" Nesta paused. "I suppose you're about to find out." The walk to Kalem's study felt like a march to the gallows. Oren led, Seren followed. Her legs moved, but she couldn't feel them. Couldn't feel anything except the frantic drumming of her pulse in her ears and the cold dread pooling in her gut. The corridors of Dreadhollow Keep were poorly lit, narrow, and built for defense rather than comfort, and right now they felt like a throat swallowing her whole. "Is he angry?" she asked Oren's back. "The Alpha doesn't do angry," Oren replied without turning around. "He does quiet. And when he goes quiet, that's when people start to worry." Seren swallowed hard. "That's not reassuring." It wasn't meant to be. They stopped at a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. Oren knocked once, pushed it open, and stepped aside. The study was smaller than she'd expected for an Alpha's private quarters. No grand desk, no imposing throne-like chair. Just a room lined with maps, a scarred wooden table covered in documents, a fire burning low in a stone hearth, and Kalem Voss standing by the window with his back to her. The evening light carved his silhouette in sharp relief. Even motionless, even facing away, the man radiated a kind of authority that made the air heavier just by being in it. Seren clasped her hands together to stop them from shaking. The door closed behind her. Oren stayed outside. She was alone with the Alpha of Dreadhollow. "Sit," Kalem said without turning around. Seren sat in the nearest chair so quickly it scraped against the stone floor with an embarrassing screech. She winced. He turned. Those dark eyes found hers, and the full force of his attention landed on her like a physical weight. Up close and without the chaos of the Great Hall, she could see things she'd missed before. The scar was more prominent in the firelight, a pale ridge running from temple to jaw. His eyes weren't just dark. They were the color of deep water on a moonless night, nearly black, and they gave away absolutely nothing. But she could see something else, too. The lines around his eyes that shouldn't have been there on a man who looked no older than 30. The slight hollowness beneath his cheekbones. The barely perceptible tremor in his left hand that he controlled by curling it into a fist at his side. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tiredness of a long day, but the deep, structural exhaustion of a man carrying something that was slowly grinding him to dust. "You activated the hearthstone," he said. Not a question. "I was scrubbing the floor," Seren replied. "I didn't mean to activate anything. I don't even know what the hearthstone is." She paused. "Or I didn't. Nesta explained some of it." "How much?" "Enough to be terrified, not enough to be useful." Something flickered across his face. Not amusement, not quite, but the faintest disruption in that wall of controlled composure. "Nesta believes you carry the bloodline of Lithenmere," he said. "Nesta believes a lot of things. I grew up farming turnips in eastern Ashgrove. The most royal thing about my family was the rooster my mother named King Bartholomew." The silence that followed was long enough that Seren had time to deeply regret every word that had just come out of her mouth. She was talking to a feared Alpha about a rooster. Her former Luna training was clearly in shambles. "The Hearthstone has never responded to anyone," Kalem said, his voice steady and measured. "Not to my father. Not to his father. Not to any healer, elder, or scholar who has studied it. In 200 years, not a single person has drawn so much as a flicker from that stone." He paused. "And then you knelt on it with a scrub brush, and it lit up like a bonfire." Seren bit the inside of her cheek. To be fair, it was a very thorough scrubbing. She saw it then, just barely. The corner of his mouth moved. The smallest twitch, suppressed almost immediately, but she saw it. "I need to understand what you are," Kalem said, stepping closer. "What you can do. Whether the Hearthstone was a singular event, or whether there's something in you that this land responds to." "You want to test me?" Seren said, her chest tightening. "A lab subject, a tool, an asset. Different Alpha, same language." His brow furrowed slightly. "I want to walk you across my territory and see if the ground wakes up where you step." That sounds like a test. It is a test, he admitted. But I'm asking, not ordering. That stopped her. Theron had never asked her anything, not once in 3 years. And if I say no? Seren asked, testing the boundary. Then you go back to scrubbing floors, and my territory continues to die, and we both pretend this conversation never happened. There it was. His territory was dying. He'd said it plainly, without performance or self-pity, and the matter-of-fact way he named the catastrophe told her he'd been carrying this truth alone for a long time. How bad is it? She asked quietly. His jaw tightened. Bad enough that I traded for a Luna I didn't want just to secure our western supply line before winter. Bad enough that the northern reaches can't sustain a hunting pack anymore. Bad enough that if something doesn't change in the next 2 years, Dreadhollow won't exist. The words landed with the weight of a confession he hadn't meant to give. She could see him regretting it already, his expression closing down, the wall rebuilding itself in real time. A Luna you didn't want, Seren repeated, and she hated how much that stung. She should have been past the point where being unwanted could hurt her. She'd had years of practice. Calem's eyes sharpened. That came out wrong. It came out honestly. Another pause. His hand uncurled from its fist, then curled again. I didn't want a political hostage, he said, his voice lower now. I didn't want a woman ripped from her home and dropped into mine against her will, Ashgrove offered. I accepted because the alternative was watching my people starve. That's not the same as not wanting you. The distinction was small but precise, and Seren felt it land somewhere unexpected, somewhere she hadn't been touched in a long time. She studied him, the exhaustion in his face, the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man bracing against a wind that never stopped blowing. Fine, she said. I'll walk your territory with you, but I have conditions. His eyebrow rose. Conditions? I want a real room, not the storage closet I've been sleeping in. I want to eat in the main hall, not in the servants' corridor. And I want the household to stop calling me the Ashgrove woman, like I'm a piece of luggage that arrived without a label. You have a name, I assume, Calem said. Seren. He repeated it quietly, almost to himself, and something about the way the syllables sounded in his voice, low and unhurried, like he was committing it to a place he wouldn't forget, made something inconvenient happen behind her ribs. Seren, he said again. You'll have your room. You'll eat where you please, and the household will use your name. He extended his hand. She looked at it, at the scars across his knuckles, at the barely there tremor he couldn't quite hide. She took it. The contact was brief, a firm grip and release, but in the half-second their palms touched, she felt it. A jolt of warmth that shot from her hand up through her arm and settled behind her ribs like a second heartbeat. And she saw his eyes widen just slightly, just for an instant, before the mask slammed back into place. We start tomorrow at dawn, he said, his voice rougher than it had been a moment ago. Dress for rough terrain. Seren stood, nodded, and walked to the door on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She was halfway down the corridor when Oren fell into step beside her. You're still alive, the beta observed. That went better than most people's first private audience with the alpha. He's not what I expected, Seren admitted. Oren glanced at her sideways. And what did you expect? A monster, she thought. Theron had always spoken of Calem Voss as something barely contained, a savage, a brute, a wolf who ruled through fear alone. But the man she'd just spoken to was controlled, deliberate, and had asked her permission when he could have simply commanded it. Someone worse, she said. Oren was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, he said, Don't tell him I said this, but he hasn't slept through the night in over a year. The territory's decline is bonded to him. As Alpha, what the land feels, he feels, and the land is in agony. Seren stopped walking. He feels the blight? Every dying tree, every poisoned river, every patch of ground that goes barren. Oren's voice was low and tight. It's killing him. Slowly, but it's killing him. And he won't tell anyone because he thinks admitting weakness will break the pack's morale. The corridor suddenly felt colder. Seren pressed her back against the wall and tried to process what she'd just been told. The tremor in his hand, the hollow cheeks, the lines around his eyes. He wasn't just tired. He was dying with his land. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Oren looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Because that stone lit up for you," he said. "And in 11 months of watching my alpha deteriorate, that's the first thing that's given me any hope at all." He left her standing alone in the dim corridor, her hand still tingling where Calem's grip had been, her mind racing with the impossible weight of what she'd just learned. She was a discarded Luna with no pack, no rank, and no power. And somehow, impossibly, she might be the only thing standing between this territory and its end. The ground beneath her feet hummed, faint and steady, like it was waiting for her to decide. They started at dawn, as promised. Calem walked ahead, setting a pace that was brisk but not punishing, his long stride eating ground with the efficiency of a man who'd been mapping this territory since before he could read. Oren trailed behind them both at a distance that suggested he was present for protection, but also very deliberately giving them space. Seren struggled to keep up at first. The terrain beyond the keep was unforgiving, all broken rock and steep inclines carpeted with dead undergrowth that crumbled to powder underfoot. The blight was worse out here. Trees stood like gray skeletons against the sky, their branches bare and brittle despite the season. No bird song. No rustle of small animals in the brush. Just wind and silence, and the faint metallic taste that coated her tongue with every breath. But the land responded to her. She didn't notice it at first. It was Calem who stopped, turned, and stared at the ground behind her with an expression she couldn't parse. "What?" Seren asked, alarmed. "Look," he said. She turned. The path behind her, the cracked and powdery soil she'd just walked across, had changed. Not dramatically. Not like a garden springing to life. But the gray had softened. Tiny hairline fractures in the earth had sealed. And along the edges of her footprints, thin and fragile as thread, something green was pushing through. Seren knelt and touched one of the sprouts with her fingertip. Warmth pulsed back. "That hasn't happened anywhere on this territory in 3 years," Calem said, his voice carefully controlled. But she caught it underneath, the tremor. Not of his hand this time, but of his composure. They kept walking. The pattern continued. Where she stepped, the ground softened. Where she touched a dead branch, the bark warmed beneath her fingers. She pressed her palm against the trunk of a birch that had gone completely gray and felt something deep inside it shudder and reach toward her touch, like a living thing turning towards sunlight. Calem watched all of it without speaking, but she noticed the way his shoulders gradually dropped from their rigid position, the way the lines around his mouth eased, the way his breathing deepened and slowed the longer they walked together. "Does it help?" she asked during a rest stop, seated on a flat boulder while he stood at the edge of a dried stream bed, looking down at stones that should have been submerged. He glanced at her. "Does what help?" "Being near me. Oren told me the land's pain is bonded to you. If the land feels better where I walk, then maybe you feel better too." He didn't answer for a long moment. His jaw worked, like he was chewing on words he didn't want to release. "Yes," he admitted finally. One word, offered like it cost him something. Seren nodded and didn't push further. She was learning that Calem gave things up in small increments, like a man paying a debt he wasn't sure he owed. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Each morning, they walked. Different routes, different sectors of the territory, mapping which areas responded strongest to her presence. Calem carried a leather journal and recorded everything with a methodical precision that reminded her, absurdly, of the ledger books she'd kept as Luna of Ashgrove. Except those ledgers had tracked grain stores and household expenses, and this one tracked the slow resurrection of a dying land. She started talking during their walks, not about anything consequential at first. Stories from Ashgrove that didn't hurt to tell. The time a visiting diplomat's horse had bolted through the formal gardens and destroyed an entire bed of prize roses. The baker who accidentally doubled the salt in the wedding cake for the pack's most senior elder and then blamed it on the apprentice, who was actually his own son. Caleb listened without comment, which she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was the questions. "The diplomat," he said one morning, 2 miles into a stretch of dead pine forest. "Which territory?" Seren blinked. "Harrowfield." "And the horse?" "Completely fine. Ate 6 rose bushes and seemed very pleased with itself." The corner of his mouth moved. She was learning to watch for that micro-expression, the barely there twitch that was Caleb's version of a laugh. It shouldn't have mattered. It shouldn't have made something warm uncurl low in her stomach every time she caught it. But it did. On the 5th evening, something shifted. They were returning to the keep along the western ridge, the sun dropping toward the tree line, when Seren stumbled on a root hidden beneath dead leaves. Her ankle turned, and she pitched forward with a yelp. Caleb caught her. His hand closed around her upper arm, firm and immediate, and he pulled her upright before she'd finished falling. For 2 seconds, maybe 3, she was pressed against his chest, his hand on her arm, his other hand braced against her back, and she could feel his heartbeat through his shirt. It was fast, much faster than a man standing still should produce. And then she felt something else. A wave of sensation rolling through the contact point, not the warm pulse of the land waking up, but something sharper, more personal. A thread of raw, bone-deep pain that wasn't hers. She gasped. It was his pain. The territory's agony bleeding through him, constant and grinding, a low scream he carried in his body every waking moment. He released her immediately, stepping back, his expression shuddering. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice clipped. "You're in pain," she said instead of answering. "Constant pain. I felt it." Something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "You felt nothing." "I felt everything," she countered, and the honesty of it startled them both. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the face of a man who wanted to say something but had long ago decided that wanting things was a luxury he couldn't afford. "We should get back," he said. That night, Seren couldn't sleep. She lay in her new room, the proper room Caleb had given her as promised, staring at the ceiling and feeling the hum of the ground beneath the keep vibrate through the bed frame. The warmth was stronger tonight, pulsing, rhythmic, almost like a summons. She closed her eyes. The hum deepened. And then the room dissolved. She was underground, vast and impossible and breathtaking. A cavern so enormous its ceiling vanished into luminous haze. Towers of pale stone rose around her, elegant and ancient, their surfaces carved with the same symbols she'd seen on the hearthstone. Golden light emanated from somewhere ahead, warm and alive, illuminating streets and bridges and archways that had clearly once been filled with thousands. Lithenmere, the lost kingdom. Not an illustration in Nesta's book. A real place, solid beneath her bare feet. But something was wrong. The light flickered. The stones were cracked. And at the edges of her vision, shadows moved, not threatening exactly, but watching, waiting. Figures that might have been people, or might have been memories, standing motionless in doorways and on balconies, their faces turned toward her. One of them stepped forward. A woman, tall and regal, with silver hair and eyes that burned like molten gold. She wore a crown. The woman opened her mouth to speak, and Seren woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, the word still forming on the ghost queen's lips. A word she hadn't heard. a name she almost recognized. She pressed her hand against her racing heart and whispered into the dark, "What do you want from me?" The ground hummed louder. It didn't answer, but it didn't stop either. Seren found Nesta before the sun was fully up, still shaking, still feeling the phantom warmth of Lithenmir's golden light on her skin. She told her everything: the underground kingdom, the towers, the watching figures, the crowned woman who had tried to speak. Nesta listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes growing sharper with every detail. "You didn't just see it," Nesta said when Seren finished. "You were there. Your feet were dirty when you came to my door." Seren looked down. Pale dust clung to the soles of her bare feet, the same fine powder that had covered Lithenmir's streets. Her stomach dropped. That's not possible. And yet, Nesta crossed to her shelves and pulled down 3 more volumes, stacking them on the workbench with practiced urgency. "The seal is responding to your blood. It's not just waking the surface stones anymore. It's pulling you in. The kingdom recognizes you." "Recognizes me as what?" Nesta opened the largest volume to a painted illustration, a woman in a crown, silver-haired, gold-eyed. Serene's breath locked in her throat because it was her, the woman from the vision. Rendered in pigment and gold leaf 3 centuries ago, Vaelith, Nesta said. Last queen of Lithenmir. She sealed the kingdom herself to protect it from the armies that conquered the surface. She scattered her bloodline among the common folk, hiding her descendants in plain sight. She paused. In places like Eastern Ash Grove, among families who grew turnips and named their roosters after kings. Seren sank onto a stool, her legs refusing to hold her. So my whole life, my entire ordinary, invisible, unremarkable life, I've been carrying this inside me and never knew? The blood lies dormant until it encounters the seal, Nesta explained. You could have lived and died in Ash Grove and never known, but you're here now, standing on top of Lithenmir's main gate. And the seal knows exactly what you are. A knock at the door. Oren entered, his expression tight with something that looked disturbingly close to alarm. Nesta, you need to come. The Alpha collapsed during the morning briefing. Seren's blood went cold. They found him in the corridor outside the council room. He was on his feet by the time they arrived, one hand braced against the wall, Oren hovering at his elbow. But his face was gray. Not pale, gray, the same lifeless ash color as the blighted trees in his territory. I'm fine, Calum said through clenched teeth. You're the color of a corpse, Nesta replied flatly. Sit down before you prove me right. He sat on a stone bench grudgingly, and Seren watched the effort it took him to maintain composure. His hands trembled openly now, both of them, and the hollows beneath his eyes had deepened overnight into bruised caverns. The blight surged last night, Nesta murmured to Oren, but Seren heard every word. The northern sector lost another mile of viable land. He would have felt that directly. Seren moved closer. Calum's gaze snapped to her, and she saw him brace, saw his walls go up, saw the stubborn, infuriating refusal to admit weakness harden his jaw. She reached out and laid her hand over his where it gripped the edge of the bench. The effect was immediate. His breathing slowed. The gray in his face receded, warmth returning like blood flowing back into frostbitten skin. His trembling hands steadied. His rigid shoulders dropped by inches. He stared at their joined hands with an expression of naked disbelief. How? He managed. She's Lithenmir's bloodline, Nesta said simply. The land responds to her. You're bonded to the land. The logic isn't complicated. Calum pulled his hand away. Not roughly, but deliberately, and the moment the contact broke, the gray crept back into his complexion within seconds. Seren felt it too, a sudden hollow absence in her chest, like a door slamming shut against warmth. No, Calum said quietly. Seren blinked. No to what? He stood, steadying himself against the wall. I know where this goes. Nesta wants you sleeping beside me so the contact is sustained. She wants proximity, physical proximity, to manage the symptoms. It would help enormously, Nesta confirmed. And what happens when the seal pulls her in deeper? Calum asked, his voice sharp enough to cut stone. She was pulled into Lithenmere last night. Physically. She came back with dust on her feet. What happens when she goes in and doesn't come back? The corridor went silent. You knew about Lithenmere? Seren asked, stunned. I've known since I was 16, Calum said, something raw and bitter threading through his voice. My father told me before he died. The seal, the kingdom, the blood that could open it. He spent his entire life searching for someone who could wake the Hearthstone. He failed, and the land killed him for it. He swallowed hard. I watched my father die by inches, Seren, the same way this territory is killing me now, and I will not drag you into the same grave. The pain in his voice was so vast it swallowed the corridor whole. She could feel it vibrating through the bond that wasn't supposed to exist yet, a tidal wave of grief and fear and guilt that he had been drowning in alone for years. So you'd rather just die? She asked, her voice cracking. I'd rather you survive, he said. Go back to your room. Stop touching the stones. Stop touching me. The less contact you have with any of it, the safer you'll be. And the territory? The territory is my burden, not yours. He turned and walked away, each step costing him visibly, his hand trailing along the wall for support he refused to ask for from anyone living. Seren watched him go and felt something rip open behind her sternum. 3 days passed. He avoided her completely. She was reassigned from the territory walks to kitchen work. Oren delivered the news with an apologetic expression and the careful phrasing of a man following orders he disagreed with. Her room was moved back to the east wing, farther from Calum's chambers, and she felt every inch of the distance. The hollowness in her chest grew worse each day. Her wolf, which had been stirring with increasing urgency since she'd arrived at Dreadhollow, now paced inside her like a caged thing, restless and aching and inconsolable. She couldn't eat without nausea. She couldn't sleep without waking to the phantom sensation of golden light and a queen's unspoken word. On the third morning, Oren appeared at her door with a face like a funeral. There's a delegation from Ashgrove at the gate, he said. Theron is here. He's demanding your return. Seren's heart seized. What? Word has spread about the Hearthstone, about what you can do. Theron wants you back. The irony was so vicious it almost made her laugh. 3 years of being invisible, and now 2 alphas were fighting over her like she was territory to be claimed. She followed Oren to the main hall. It was packed. Every ranked member of Dreadhollow stood along the walls, tense and silent. At the far end, flanked by 4 Ashgrove warriors, stood Theron. He looked exactly the same. Composed, polished, eyes scanning the room with practiced authority. When he saw her, he smiled, and the sight of that smile, warm and familiar and absolutely false, made bile rise in her throat. Seren, he said, his voice carrying across the hall. I've come to bring you home. Before she could respond, a door behind the raised platform opened and Calum entered. He looked terrible, ashen, hollow, visibly unsteady, but his expression was carved from granite, and when he spoke, his voice filled every corner of the room. She stays. Theron's smile didn't waver. She's my Luna, my mate. The terms of our accord didn't include permanent transfer. The terms included her residence at Dreadhollow for the duration of the accord, which has 9 years remaining. Calum replied coldly. She stays. Theron turned to Seren, and his expression shifted into something that mimicked tenderness so convincingly it would have fooled anyone who didn't know him. Seren, darling. Tell them you want to come home. The word darling landed like acid on her skin. He had never once called her that in private. Seren looked at Theron. She looked at Calum. gray-faced and trembling and standing his ground despite looking like he might collapse at any moment. She looked at the assembled faces of a pack that had barely acknowledged her existence 3 weeks ago, and she opened her mouth to respond, but the room tilted. The emptiness inside her surged, her vision whited out at the edges, and the last thing she heard before the ground rushed up to meet her was Caleb's voice, raw and wrecked and stripped of every wall he'd ever built, shouting her name like it was the only word he knew. He caught her. Of course he caught her. She felt his arms close around her, felt herself pulled against his chest, felt the frantic hammer of his heart beneath her ear. And the moment their bodies made contact, the hollowness in her chest flooded with warmth so intense, she gasped. She heard Theron say something sharp and demanding. She heard Caleb's response, low and lethal, vibrating through his chest against her cheek. "Touch her, and I will end you." The hall erupted into noise, but Seren was already slipping under, Caleb's arms tight around her, his heartbeat the last sound she heard before the dark took her. She woke in his bed. She knew it was his before she opened her eyes. The scent gave it away. Wood smoke and iron and something warmer beneath. Something that smelled like safety in a way she couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. Seren opened her eyes. The room was dim, curtains drawn, firelight casting amber shadows across unfamiliar walls. This was the Alpha's private chamber, larger than any room she'd been in at Dreadhollow, but sparse, almost austere. A weapons rack on one wall, a desk buried under maps, and the bed she was lying in, massive and draped in dark linen, was the only concession to comfort in the entire space. Nesta sat beside her, checking her pulse. "Back with us?" Nesta asked. "What happened?" "You collapsed. The bond separation was killing you both, though neither of you had the sense to admit it." She released Seren's wrist. "Caleb carried you here and has been standing outside that door for 4 hours refusing to come in because, and I quote, he doesn't want to make you uncomfortable." Seren sat up too quickly. The room swam. "Where's Theron?" "Gone." Caleb gave him a choice between leaving voluntarily and being escorted out by every warrior in the keep. Theron chose door number 1. Nesta paused. "Smart man. First smart thing he's done by my count." "And Caleb?" "Dying slightly faster than yesterday, but too proud to do anything about it." Nesta stood and gathered her things with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had lost patience with both parties several days ago. "I'm going to send him in now, and I'd strongly suggest you two stop being idiots before this territory loses its alpha, and I lose my 2 most frustrating patients in the same week." She left. The door closed. Silence settled over the room like snow. Then it opened again, and Caleb filled the doorway. He looked worse than she'd ever seen him. The gray had spread from his face down to his hands. His eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, were bloodshot and shadowed. He leaned against the doorframe like it was the only thing holding him vertical. But he was looking at her. Really looking. Not the controlled assessment he usually offered. Not the careful neutrality he wore like armor. He was looking at her the way a man looks at the one thing in the world he wants most and has convinced himself he cannot have. "You're awake," he said, and his voice broke on the second word. "Come here," Seren said. He didn't move. "Seren, I meant what I said. I won't risk you." "And I meant what I said 3 days ago. Would you really rather die? If it keeps you safe." "It doesn't keep me safe," she said, and felt tears building behind her eyes. "I collapsed in the Great Hall. The bond is already formed, Caleb. Whether you touch me or don't touch me, whether I sleep here or on the other side of the keep, we're already connected. The only thing your distance is doing is killing us both faster." He flinched, physically flinched like she'd struck him. "How long have you known about the bond?" she asked. His hand gripped the doorframe until his knuckles went white. "Since the handshake, in my study, the first time we touched." "Weeks." He'd known for weeks and said nothing. Carried it alone, like he carried everything alone. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you didn't choose this," he said, and the rawness in his voice was devastating. "You didn't choose to be given away. You didn't choose to come here. You didn't choose me. And I refuse to be another alpha who takes your choices from you." The tears spilled over. She didn't wipe them away. "You're right," she whispered. "I didn't choose any of those things. But I'm choosing now." She held out her hand. He stared at it. The firelight caught the tremor running through his entire body, exhaustion and pain and something fiercer wrestling beneath his control. "I don't want to hurt you," he breathed. "Then stop leaving me," Seren said. "That's what hurts." He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand closed around hers and the warmth detonated between them, flooding through every point of contact, racing up her arm and settling into her chest like a sun being born behind her ribs. She gasped. He made a sound that was half groan, half something broken finally being set right. She pulled him down onto the bed beside her. He came without resistance, all that iron control dissolving the moment she touched him. She pressed her palm against his chest and felt his heartbeat steady under her hand, felt the gray recede from his skin in real time, felt the trembling stop. "You stubborn, impossible man," she murmured. His hand came up to cradle her face. His thumb traced the tear track on her cheek. "You collapsed in front of my entire pack, and your former mate, and you're calling me stubborn?" "Yes, because you watched me collapse rather than admit you needed me." Something cracked behind his eyes. The last wall. The final defense. "I need you," he said, and the words came out like they'd been locked inside him for years, not weeks. Years. "I need you so much it terrifies me." She kissed him. She leaned up and pressed her mouth against his, and it wasn't graceful or gentle. It was desperate. The kiss of 2 people who had been drowning within arm's reach of each other and had finally closed the distance. He responded like a man starving. His hands slid into her hair. His mouth moved against hers with a hunger that stole the air from her lungs. He kissed her like she was oxygen, like she was the first full breath he'd taken in years. "I was so afraid," he said between kisses, his forehead pressed against hers. "When you fell, when he called you darling and I saw your face, I wanted to tear him apart." "He means nothing to me," Seren said, pulling him closer. "He never did. I just didn't know what something real felt like until now." Calum pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm on her lips. His hand cradled the back of her neck, holding her close, and the tenderness of it nearly broke her. "If we do this," he murmured, "the bond completes. There's no undoing it. I know. You'll be tied to me, to this dying territory, to all of it." "I know," she repeated, and kissed him again, slowly this time, pouring everything she couldn't say into the press of her lips against his. What followed was quiet and sacred and theirs alone. He held her like she was the most important thing in the world, and she held him back. And somewhere in the space between heartbeats, the bond sealed. It was like a door opening inside her. Not a bite, not a mark, but a flood of warmth and radiance pouring through a connection that had always existed but had never been unlocked. She felt him, all of him, his pain, his grief, his years of lonely burden, and beneath it all, a love so vast and so carefully guarded it made her weep. The land responded through their bond, a deep pulse of warmth rising from below, golden and ancient, as though Lythanmere itself was breathing easier. He held her close, his arms wrapped around her like he intended to hold her through every remaining night of his life. She pressed her ear to his chest and listened to his heartbeat, strong and steady for the first time since she'd known him. "Stay," he whispered into her hair. "Not an order, a request." "Always," she replied. He fell asleep holding her. Deep, dreamless, peaceful sleep, the kind his body had been begging for. She watched his face soften in the firelight, watched the gray recede further, watched the lines around his eyes ease. She closed her eyes, let the warmth of the bond hum through her, and woke, standing barefoot on the streets of Lithenmere, the crowned queen waiting directly in front of her, golden eyes blazing. "Finally," the queen said, "we don't have much time." Lithenmere was dying. Seren could see it now in a way the earlier visions hadn't shown her. The golden light that illuminated the underground kingdom flickered and guttered like a candle in its final hour. Cracks split the pale stone towers from base to spire. The streets, once grand, were buckling inward, and the air tasted of something old and exhausted, a place that had been holding its breath for 300 years and couldn't hold it any longer. The queen stood before her, and up close, she was both more beautiful and more terrible than Seren had imagined. Valeth's silver hair moved without wind. Her golden eyes burned with an intensity that bordered on pain, and she was translucent at the edges, flickering in and out of solidity like a flame in a draft. "You're fading," Seren said. "Everything here is fading," Valeth replied. Her voice carried the weight of centuries. "The seal was built to preserve, not to imprison, but 300 years without renewal has turned protection into suffocation. My people are trapped. My kingdom is choking on its own magic, and the poison is bleeding upward into the land your mate calls home. Your mate." The words landed with unexpected force. The bond hummed in Seren's chest, warm and golden, and through it she could feel Calem above her, sleeping, peaceful, unaware that she was standing in the ruins of an underground civilization. "What do I need to do?" Seren asked. "Open the seal. Release us." "How?" Valeth studied her with those burning eyes. "The seal responds to blood. My blood. Your blood. But it won't yield to blood alone. It was locked with grief, with the belief that hiding was the only way to survive, and it can only be opened by someone who understands that grief and chooses to move through it." The ground trembled. Dust cascaded from the cracked ceiling far above, and somewhere in the distance, stone collapsed with a sound like thunder swallowed by earth. "This kingdom was buried because we believed we weren't strong enough to exist in the open," Valeth continued, and her voice cracked for the first time. "We were conquered, scattered, told we were nothing, and instead of rising, I sealed us away. I told my people that hiding was safety, that being invisible was the same as being protected." She looked at Seren with a recognition that pierced straight through her. "You understand that lie, don't you?" Serene's breath caught. Because she did. She understood it the way she understood her own heartbeat. Instinctive and inescapable. 3 years of making herself small in Ashgrove. Years before that of being the quiet daughter, the agreeable girl, the one who never caused trouble because causing trouble meant being noticed, and being noticed meant risking rejection. She had sealed herself away long before Theron gave her away. She had buried every want, every need, every sharp edge of her personality beneath a surface so smooth and accommodating that no one ever had to see her. And she'd told herself that was safety. "I hid," Seren whispered. "My whole life. I made myself invisible so no one would have a reason to throw me away. And they threw me away anyway." The watching figures at the edges of the street stirred, hundreds of them, thousands. The trapped citizens of Lithenmere, caught between life and death for 3 centuries, their faces turned toward her with expressions of desperate, exhausted hope. "You cannot open the seal while you still believe you deserve to be hidden," Valeth said. "Seren." A voice behind her, deep, rough, and terrified. She spun. Calem stood at the end of the street, barefoot, shirtless, pulled into Lithenmere through the bond the same way she had been. His eyes were wide, taking in the crumbling kingdom around him with the expression of a man seeing his nightmare and his salvation in the same glance. "You shouldn't be here," Seren started. "Neither should you. he countered, already moving toward her. I woke up and you were gone. Not gone from the bed. Gone. Your body was there, but you weren't in it. He reached her and his hands found her shoulders, steadying her, steadying himself. The seal, he said, looking at Valeth. She has to open it. She has to choose to. Valeth corrected. Caleb looked down at Seren, and the fear in his face was so raw it hurt to witness. What does that mean? Seren took a breath. It means I have to stop hiding. For real. Not just from Theron, not just from Ashgrove. From everything. She swallowed. I spent my whole life believing I had to earn my place, that if I was quiet enough, useful enough, invisible enough, I'd be safe. But all it did was teach everyone around me that I was easy to give away. Her voice broke. She let it. You kept the bond secret because you didn't want to take my choices away, she said, looking up at Kalum. But I kept myself secret my entire life because I was afraid that if anyone really saw me, they'd decide I wasn't worth keeping. Kalum's hands tightened on her shoulders. You are worth everything, he said, low and fierce and absolute. Everything. Then let me do this, she said. Let me be seen. She turned to face the queen, the watching thousands, the crumbling towers and the dying light. She could feel the seal beneath her feet, ancient and exhausted. A lock that had held for 300 years because the woman who said it believed that hiding was the only option. Seren pressed her palms against the ground. The stone was warm. The hum she'd felt since arriving at Dread Hollow intensified, filling her body, vibrating through her bones and blood, and the golden thread of the bond. I see you, she said to the dead, all of you. You deserved better than this. You deserve to exist in the open, to be known, to be remembered. And so do I. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't a spell or an incantation. They were just the truth. Spoken aloud for the first time by someone who finally believed it. The seal shattered. Not violently. It dissolved. Like frost meeting sunlight, like a held breath released. Golden light erupted from the ground, pouring upward through the cracks and fissures, flooding the streets, the towers, the cavern ceiling. The trapped figures dissolved into the light, one by one, their faces shifting from anguish to peace as 3 centuries of imprisonment finally ended. Valeth smiled. It was the most beautiful and the saddest thing Seren had ever seen. Thank you, the queen whispered, and then she was light, and then she was gone. The kingdom trembled. The towers began to sink, not collapsing but settling, returning to the earth that had held them. The golden light rushed upward, through the stone, through the soil, through the roots of dead trees and the beds of dry rivers, carrying 300 years of trapped life force back into the land that had been starving for it. Caleb grabbed her hand. The ground shifted beneath them, and the world went white. Seren woke in his arms, in his bed, in the gray light of early morning. She could feel it immediately, even before she opened her eyes. The hum beneath the keep was different, not desperate, not strained, steady, calm, like a heartbeat finding its rhythm after years of arrhythmia. Caleb was already awake, looking down at her. His face was different. The gray was gone. The hollows beneath his eyes had softened. The tremor in his hands had disappeared entirely. Look, he said softly, and tilted his head toward the window. Seren turned. Through the glass, in the pale dawn light, the hillside beyond the keep was green. Not the sickly, struggling green of a single sprout pushing through dead soil. Green, rich, and deep, and alive, rolling across the landscape like a tide. She pressed her hand to her mouth and sobbed. Caleb pulled her against his chest and held her while she cried, while relief and joy and grief for everything she'd lost and everything she'd gained poured out of her in equal measure. You did that, he murmured against her hair. We did that, she corrected, her voice muffled against his shirt. He kissed the top of her head. We did that. The land didn't heal overnight, but it healed. Week by week, the blight receded. Rivers ran clear. Trees pushed out new growth. Prey returned to the northern reaches, and the metallic taste that had haunted the air for years faded to nothing. Calem's strength returned with his territory. The gray left his skin permanently. He slept through the night, every night, with Seren beside him. Sometimes she woke before him and watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, the peace in his face, and felt the bond hum between them like a song neither of them had known they needed to hear. Word reached Ashgrove eventually. The Hearthstone, the bloodline, the kingdom released. Theron sent a formal letter requesting renewed negotiations. Calem used it to light the fire in his study. Seren didn't ask him to dignify it with a response. He didn't offer one. The pack adjusted. It took time. A former Luna from a rival territory, bonded to their alpha, carrying the blood of an ancient kingdom that had reshaped their land from beneath, was not a simple thing to absorb. But Seren had spent a lifetime learning how to manage a household, and Dread Hollow's people, stubborn and guarded as they were, eventually stopped calling her the Ashgrove woman and started calling her by name. On a morning 3 months after the seal broke, Seren stood in the great hall of Dread Hollow Keep. Not on her knees, not scrubbing anyone's floor. She stood at the center of the room, directly over the hearthstone, which glowed softly beneath her feet with a steady, contented warmth, and she looked out at the hall, where her life had changed. Calem appeared beside her. His hand found hers, and the contact sent the same steady warmth through her that it always did, reliable and constant as sunrise. "You're standing on the hearthstone again," he observed. "It likes me," Seren replied. The corner of his mouth moved. That small, barely there twitch she had learned to watch for, had learned to treasure, had learned to call his smile. "It's not the only one," he said quietly. Seren squeezed his hand. The stone hummed beneath her. The morning light poured through the tall windows, falling across the banners and the iron chandeliers, and the scarred flagstone floor that had once felt like a prison. It felt like home now.